From Carl Place, New York, this is Harren K. Appelman, once again for Nakamichi Spoken Here. Welcome to our Spring 1978 News Cassette. It's been a bit too long since I last communicated to you, our Nakamichi salespeople, through this particular medium. I find myself having to apologize again for failing to keep these tapes coming out regularly. But if you've been following Nakamichi's activities at all for the past year, you know that it's been an extremely busy one. There's so much talk of new things like digital recording and new tape formulations that I could easily spend a whole tape talking about products of the future. But what I'd like to do this time is indulge in a little rumor squashing. I want to talk about some things that are being said about Nakamichi products by others in the industry, in particular our competitors. Or to narrow it down a bit more, let's say a well-known and respected Norwegian competitor whose brand name begins with a T and ends in ANDBERG. The Norwegians, of course, do not want to be outdone by the Japanese, and they would love nothing more than to sell more cassette decks, and so it's only natural that they try to put down Nakamichi. Well, we've always welcomed competition, especially from a manufacturer of high reputation like Tandberg. But their latest hatchet jobs on Nakamichi surprised us a bit, because their tactics show no class or creativity. Let me get down to some specifics. One of the things I hear frequently from our dealers is Tandberg's claim that their azimuth alignment system on the TCD 330 is more accurate than our LED beacon system on our 3-head decks because they use a high-frequency tone while we use a mid-band 400 Hz test tone. Now that sounds reasonable, unless of course you know better. First, their high-frequency tone, 10 kHz, is not nearly high enough for truly accurate azimuth alignment. When we set up the playback head azimuth on our 3-head decks, we use a 20 kHz test tape. But instead of building a 20K test tone generator in our 3-head decks, which would have added to the cost and would have been difficult for the user to master, we came up with an elegant solution which employs the 400 Hz 0 dB test tone already built into the deck for record level calibration. Our 400 Hz azimuth alignment method is actually a digital phase detection system, and it yields azimuth alignment every bit as accurate as using a 20 kHz test tone, and it's much easier to use. The 400 Hz signal is taken from the playback head and converted into a series of digital pulses. The pulses for both channels are fed into a phase comparator, which is capable of detecting the smallest amount of phase lag or lead. Now, when the record head is properly aligned with respect to the playhead, the left and right channels should be in phase. The pulses will appear at the comparator simultaneously, and the alignment beacons will flash alternately to signal proper alignment. We could, of course, do the same thing at a higher frequency, but with this method, which by the way is patented, there is no need to use a higher frequency. In fact, with a high-frequency tone, like 10 kHz, the wavelength is so short that the left and right channels could be 360 degrees out of phase, in other words, a full wave cycle off, which would mean gross azimuth misalignment. By using 400 Hz, we eliminate the possibility of this type of error. When the two beacons flash, it can only mean one thing: the record head azimuth is precisely aligned. Just to demonstrate how accurate the system is, align the record head as usual on our 700 or 1000, and then turn the alignment screw just a bit in one direction. You'll notice that the beacons no longer flash evenly. Now make a recording of music with strong high-frequency content with the slightly misadjusted head. You'll find it difficult to hear any high-frequency loss. Now this means that our azimuth alignment system is capable of detecting error that not even your ear can detect. One of the most disturbing things I'd seen in a while was the white paper entitled A Comparison Between the Nakamichi 600 and the TCD 310 Mark II, circulated among dealers by Tandberg. Many of our dealers, some of whom are also Tandberg dealers, sent us copies of this so-called comparison and asked how they could combat this type of propaganda. Well, I immediately went to the nearest Tandberg dealer and helped Tandberg sales by buying a TCD 310 Mark II and sent it to Tokyo for analysis on our B&K test instruments. I was all prepared to publish a rebuttal, fully supported by test instrument charts and graphs, no hand-drawn curves. The data would have been damaging to Tandberg, I'm certain, but at the last minute, I talked it over with Mr. Nakamichi, and we both agreed that it would not be consistent with Nakamichi's marketing philosophies to engage in this sort of bad-mouthing contest, even though we have hard scientific evidence on our side. And besides, you all know by this time that the 600 is being replaced by the 600 Mark II, which I'll be talking about on a future tape. I will deal with questions raised by the Tamberg white paper on a case-by-case basis. If you have any specific doubts or concerns, you should waste no time in calling me or someone else here at our New York office, Collect. There is no doubt that Tamberg makes an excellent product. Our tests verify that. But you shouldn't forget the motivation behind a white paper of the type circulated by Tamberg. I think one of our dealers said it best when he sent us a copy of the Tamberg paper and wrote in his cover letter the following. Quote, "My first reaction was that Nakamichi must be hurting Tamberg's sales to a painful extent for them to resort to this type of mailing." Unquote. Our sentiments exactly. But like I said before, we welcome honest competition. This is a free country. All it takes for Tamberg or anyone to sell more than Nakamichi is to make a better cassette deck, and we invite them to try. Once again, down to some specifics. On page 3 of the Tamberg white paper, there is a list of supposed disadvantages of the Nakamichi 600. Let me comment on the more interesting ones. Number 1 on their list, quote, "The sales brochure contains performance curves and data that cannot be achieved," unquote. Cannot be achieved by Tamberg, maybe, but we certainly do achieve them. Any of you listening who has had the 600 on a test bench know that our published specs are all on the conservative side by a comfortable margin. Independent test reports bear that out as well. A booklet of test reports on the 600 entitled Test Results, enclosed with this cassette, should be interesting reading for those of you who have not yet read these reviews. And of course, you know that our specs are guaranteed. That means if one of our products does not meet published specifications, it is considered defective and will be repaired in warranty. Number 2, quote, "Poor signal-to-noise ratio, 3 to 5 dB worse than the TCD 310 Mark II," unquote. This is not true. Our tests show that signal-to-noise ratio, reference to 1 kHz, 3% total harmonic distortion record level, with Dolby In and A weighting, is about the same for both machines. Actually, with our sample of the TCD 310 Mark II, the typical 600 did about 1 dB better in signal-to-noise. Now, if we limited the high-frequency response of the 600 at 16 kHz, as in the TCD 310 Mark II, we would actually have a significantly better signal-to-noise ratio. We furthermore did not use the 600's IM suppressor in any of our measurements. We are able to offer wider frequency range without sacrificing signal-to-noise simply because our crystal permalloy record playback head is vastly superior to the Michigan Magnetics permalloy head used in the Tamberg TCD 310 Mark II. Elsewhere in Tamberg's paper, they remark that they were unable to find any particular advantages to our focused field head and that we used too narrow a gap. But I'd be willing to bet that if we ever offered our crystalloy head for sale to other cassette deck manufacturers, Tamberg would be one of the first in line. Number 3, quote, "Very uncertain location for cassette in cassette compartment, which means that the frequency response changes," unquote. By uncertain location, Tamberg is undoubtedly referring to the fact that we use a 3-point floating support system for registering the cassette housing inside the compartment. It's true that if you push on a cassette inside the 600, it will seem loose, especially when compared to the Tamberg's cassette registration system, which holds the cassette shelf firmly with no play at all. Tamberg believes their system is superior. Obviously, we don't. Now let me put things into perspective a bit. Before Nakamichi became Nakamichi brand in 1973, we manufactured over 500,000 cassette decks for sale under various brands. We were the first Dolby licensed manufacturer. We were the first, you'll remember, to introduce a true 3-head cassette deck and the first to offer pulse-controlled DC servo motor drive with IC Logic transport control in a cassette deck. We have played a major role in developing the cassette medium into what it is today. You might say we know a few things about cassette recording. So, if cassettes seem loose in the well with our decks, believe me, it's that way for a good reason. If all cassette housings were created equal, holding the cassette down firmly would be acceptable. But we know what cassettes are like in real life. They have their own internal rollers and guides, and each plastic housing seems to have a will of its own. A good transport must be capable of adjusting and compensating for the vagaries of the cassette. With our 3-point support system, the tape travel path is allowed to seek its own level, so to speak. Our system prevents rather than causes frequency response variation caused by improper tape travel. Number 4 on Tamberg's list of supposed problems with the 600 is, quote, small curvature radius on the playback head means a short life, unquote. Now this is a new one on me. Curvature radius is related to head life? Our superhead, which we introduced on the 1000 Mark II and 700 Mark II last year, as well as on the 600 Mark II this year, actually decreases head surface area to promote even wear, yielding an unprecedented head life figure of 10,000 hours. Now the older 600, of course, did not have the superhead, but we have never heard of small curvature radius causing unforeseen head wear problems. Now our head surface is shaped the way it is to eliminate contour effect, also known as head bumps. That's the uneven low-frequency response that's worse in some decks than others. The tapering of the surface on both sides of the gap reduces contour effect at its source so that we do not have to resort to distortion-causing equalization later on to remove the bumps. Number 5, quote, no microphone amplifier, unquote. True enough, you can't win them all. Number 7 on their list, quote, meter does not show record current preemphasis, giving possibility of overload, unquote. Tamberg has always placed their meters after the EQ circuit. Our meters have always had flat frequency response. We think there are legitimate views on either side of the fence. Either system can be useful in setting the proper record level, and either system requires little experience to master. At least we agree on using peak reading meters. Now, as we see it, there are at least 2 problems with metering the equalized signal. 1. Since the meters will not have flat frequency response with respect to the incoming signal, the meters become useful only as record level indicators. Our meters can additionally be used for tape deck measurements, such as frequency response testing. 2. The record preemphasis curve does not necessarily reflect true tape saturation characteristics. What would happen if you switch from MaxL UD to UDXL1, 2 tapes that are recommended in Tamberg's manual for use in the deck's normal position? UDXL1 has more headroom, but the preemphasis curve remains the same for both tapes, meaning the meters will not reflect the difference in headroom. The user would have to adjust manually for the difference, just as he would with a flat metering system. I might mention another thing I noticed about Tamberg's meters. If you feed the deck a 400 Hz signal and set the meters to read 0 dB, and then attenuate the input 10 dB at a time, you will notice this. With a minus 10 dB signal, the meter will read minus 10. But with a minus 20 dB signal, the meter will read minus 30. It seems to me they took a regular minus 20 to plus 5 dB scale meter and relabeled the low end to create the illusion of wide dynamic range metering. Number 8, quote, too much distortion at the Dolby level, unquote. False. Distortion at Dolby level was identical for the 600 and the TCD 310 Mark II. With TDK-SA, MaxL UDXL2, or Nakamichi SX, the THD figure at 400 Hz Dolby level was a low 1.1% with either machine. This distortion figure is lower than the same for most other cassette decks on the market, and speaks well for both the 600 and the TCD 310 Mark II. Number 10, quote, significant dropouts with 400 Hz test tone, unquote. We've noticed dropouts too, but only when we use inferior tape. The problem in such cases is obviously in the tape. If the tape suffers from dropout, it shouldn't really matter whether you're using the 600 or the TCD 310 Mark II. Number 11, quote, transport does not pull in loop from start, unquote. True, but we haven't really noticed this to be a problem. Neither do any of the other manufacturers around the world, apparently, because Tamberg is the only cassette deck with this feature. It seems like a nice feature, but nobody really seems to be in a hurry to incorporate it into their decks. Number 12, quote, end stop does not work with backward winding when the pause button is pressed, unquote. Translated, this means the 600's auto shutoff will not work if you rewind with the pause button down. Now, it's hard for me to imagine why anybody would be rewinding with the pause button down, especially since on the 600 you have to push stop before pushing rewind, and depressing stop disengages pause. That means a person would have to go to the trouble of actually pushing pause first before hitting rewind in order for you to get the condition that Tamberg describes. In any event, if this still troubles some of you, we have a solution. Do not rewind with the pause button engaged. Speaking of auto shutoff, have you noticed that Tamberg's end-of-tape shutoff isn't really a shutoff at all? Try rewinding a cassette on the TCD310 Mark II. You'll notice that the rewind button stays in after the cassette has been wound, and it will stay depressed until you go over and push the stop button. When you do push the stop button, watch the cassette reels carefully. Notice that they slacken as soon as you push stop. Tamberg's end-of-tape shutoff seems to operate by virtue of the fact that once the tape reaches its end, it cannot be wound any further. Number 15 on their list, quote, long time constant for end stop, unquote. Tamberg is referring to the few seconds it takes for a transport to disengage at the end of the tape. This is true, but at least our transport does fully disengage. It is a true and complete auto shutoff. Tamberg can't say the same for their TCD310 Mark II. Number 16, quote, low winding speed, unquote. Someone once suggested that we relabel our fast forward button to read slow forward. Well, with 2 more motors, you'd hope the Tamberg would wind the cassette faster. In fact, with 3 motors and 2 capstans, you'd expect the TCD310 transport to have less wow and flutter and less tape modulation than the 600 with its single motor and capstan. We expected that it would, but we were surprised. Our sample of the TCD310 Mark II measured 0.13% on playback din, peak, wow, and flutter. This is within Tamberg specifications, but surprisingly high in view of the fact that the single capstan 600 is guaranteed to have less than 0.12% wow and flutter, and our double capstan 1000 Mark II and 700 Mark II machines are guaranteed to have less than 0.1% wow and flutter. Modulation noise, too, was somewhat high on the TCD310 Mark II, given its double capstan design. On our spectrum analyzer, we can clearly see the advantages of a well-designed double capstan transport. Our 1000 Mark II, for example, exhibits substantially lower modulation, over 1 kHz input signal, than our own 600. But the TCD310 exhibited about the same amount of modulation sidebands as the 600. It seems to me Tamberg hasn't fully explored the advantages of a double capstan transport. Now, if you are wondering what tape modulation sidebands look like on a spectrum analyzer, a good example is given in the transport section of our color brochure on the 1000 Mark II. To be fair to Tamberg, I want to reiterate that they make an exceptionally fine product. The TCD310 Mark II we measured was clearly several cuts above most other cassette decks on the market. The electronics of the TCD310 Mark II, although not quite as low in distortion as the electronics of the 600, proved to be quieter and more distortion-free than most Japanese cassette decks. Dolby tracking was excellent on the TCD310 Mark II, as long as you used the tape that matched the factory record cal settings. Tamberg doesn't believe in providing user-adjustable record cal, and it's too bad because their deck's Dolby performance is better than most. I could go on pointing out inaccuracies in Tamberg's paper. Some of their, quote, technical criticisms on the 600 show a surprising lack of understanding of the basic principles underlying cassette recording. I think I've said enough for one sitting, however, and so I'll end this discussion here. But I do want to mention one last thing. I have recently gotten an unsolicited verbal apology from a person on Tamberg's sales staff regarding the TCD310 versus Knox 600 comparison white paper. It seems there are differences in opinion within their organization about marketing strategy. Now, this person, who has requested anonymity for obvious reasons, agreed that it was Tamberg who is ultimately going to suffer from what seems to be their current headhunting approach to marketing. I've covered most of the questions brought up by Tamberg's paper. If you have any others, like I said earlier, call me. Discussions like these are unfortunately often necessary, but they are never pleasant. Next time, I hope to be talking about more enjoyable topics, like our new products. Before I sign off, I want to introduce to you some new members on our staff here in New York. First, assisting me with the handling of technical and general inquiries is Glenn Esterson. Glenn is our Product Information Manager, and he joined us last October. He routinely handles customer correspondence and telephone inquiries, as well as questions from our dealers, so if I'm ever not in when you call the New York office, you can ask for Glenn. He'll be more than happy to help you. Ken Oba, also here at the New York office as Director of Dealer Relations, has two new assistants who recently arrived from Tokyo, Jun Azuma and Kenzo Sugao. Jun is spelled J-U-N, and Kenzo is K-E-N-Z-O. They are also available to help you with any questions or problems you might encounter with our products, so feel free to give them a call. Some of you may have already heard from and spoken to one of these gentlemen. They look forward to meeting you personally sometime in the near future. As usual, Side B of this cassette contains demonstration material duplicated at real time, in other words, 1 7/8 IPS. The original recordings we've used this time are excerpted from various live recording sessions we've had at our New York Sound Research Center studio and at our new concert hall in Tokyo. I hope you enjoy the selections. That's all for now. And so until next time, this is Harren K. Appelman, Technical Director for Nakamichi Spoken Here.
remember this. A kiss is still a kiss. I say it just to sigh. The fundamental things are bright as time goes by. And when two lovers woo, they still say I love you. On that you can rely. No matter what a future brings as time goes by. Moonlight love songs, never light of day. Hearts full of passion, jealousy and hate. Woman is man, and man must have its mate. That no one can deny. It's still the same old story, a fight for love and growing, a case of do or die. The world will always welcome lovers as time goes by. Moonlight love songs, never light of day. Hearts full of passion, jealousy and hate. Woman is man, and man must have its mate. That no one can deny. It's still the same old story, a fight for love and growing, a case of do or die. The world will always welcome lovers as time